So could you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background as far as you're comfortable with that?
Yeah, of course. My name is Gustav. I'm 31 years old. I spent around 12 years in the German forces and as an officer at the armored infantry. And since April of this year, I decided to join the fight in Ukraine. Yeah.
And how much do you know about Ukraine before February 24th? Were you familiar with the war in the Donbass and generally the history of the Ukrainian and Russian conflict?
In general, yes, to a certain degree, I would say. It's not really deeply that I would say what my interest was in the back then. During the time this conflict I was actually in the military, so I followed all the news out of the military perspective and followed it to a certain time frame. But after a certain time, there was like a fatigue of interest in this conflict because it lasted very long and it was like smoldering on a small flame for a long time, and then you lose at a certain point interest. So maybe it was interesting in 2014 and 2015. After that, your interest shifted to other conflicts we had around the world who was way more prominent, like the stuff in Syria, Iraq, and so on, which was more focus points from my professional side for the interest and work.
So you would say you were just observing it from like a civilian standpoint, just watching the media, not particularly being emotionally involved?
No, it was like no emotional involvement. It was like a professional interest, what's going on there, how, and I wasn't involved in this country in any other cases. I knew a little bit about this country, but followed the news, tried to gather my information, but that was it.
Okay. And you mentioned a little bit about the wars in Iraq and Syria and being interested in from a professional standpoint. Did you have any participation in this or before?
Yeah, I was, as I said, in the German forces. We had a lot to do in Afghanistan and in a small scale in Iraq. So I was also in Afghanistan and so on. This was mostly the focus point of our forces and all the members, and what the professionality came from was focused on this stabilization operations in this context, in this area. So, yeah.
Where were you on February 24th when the war began? What did you feel in the moment? What was going through your head? Did you hear about the war when it happened, or was there some delay and you didn't hear about it until after a day or something?
I actually heard it really fast. I was on this day, I was on work. I was working in a project management company. We had a project in France. And I was following frequently all news from different channels, not only the obvious news channels, but also direct information from open source channels on the internet, because this was a really tense situation beforehand with all these exercises from the Russian and Belarusians around Ukraine. And till the last moment, I thought this wouldn't happen like an invasion, because the forces they gathered was large, but not large enough to attack a whole country. I mean, somewhere between 150 and 200,000 troops, which is, for such a military operation, really not much to attack a whole country. I didn't thought they really do it. I saw till the last moment it was like a flexing of muscles to gain some ground on a diplomatic area, to push some to push some decisions from the Ukrainians or something like this, but never have thought that something like this would happen. So I was actually pretty surprised. So.
I think this feeling of surprise and disbelief is very common among most people, because not very many people believe it. Even in Ukraine, most people, until the first rockets were fired, they didn't really think it was possible. So, for me, for example, it was very surreal. I woke up and I didn't believe it. It was like being in a movie. And I'm just wondering what was going more through your head, not analytically, but emotionally. How did you experience it?
Yeah, it was actually pretty shocked, because I never thought something like this on this scale would happen again on a European country, on such a country ever again. I mean, we had peace for the last 70 years around on this continent, and we are not used to such drastic measurements on a diplomatic scale in this area anymore. I think we passed that point. We learned our lessons from the past, and I actually never thought this could be happened on some countries in this area. We was all involved in the Second World War, which was like a shock therapy on a diplomatic area for involved countries to never do some shit like this again. We had all this economical and diplomatic involvements in each other countries. So I never believed that something is necessary or possible anymore.
Yeah, and then you obviously felt shocked about it, surprised. Yeah. And at what point did these feelings of shock turn into a motivation to actually participate into that? What moved you to volunteer for the Legion? What was your motivation? How did you arrive at such an idea?
My motivation was actually pretty fast. Only after a few days of the invasion, I formed the decision to do something, because I knew that I had, during my military time, this skill set, and I know how to lead or train people in such situations, and did it in the past during my missions, like in Afghanistan also. And I thought, I don't feel comfortable by doing nothing, but by just donating money or stuff, it doesn't feel enough, because I don't want to treat some symptoms. I want to treat the cause itself for this problem. And then I thought the best thing I could do is what I've done for 12 years, and somehow I can maybe participate and do something.
And is that motivation, from the ideological standpoint, is it more about defending democracy or defending the people, or were you shocked by the atrocities, or what is the main ideological motivation for you to care about this conflict? Because there have been wars in the past, and these things happen. But what is it about this conflict that really pushed you to act? What is your internal drive for this?
I think the first intention was that I saw in the past a lot of countries who had wars in their recent history, and saw the devastation of these countries and the problems the people live with for decades and so on. So I think the first motivation was definitely the people. Directly on the second step, I think the loss of democratic values through this, because that was I knew if they lose this struggle, they will lose their democratic rights and potential and so on, and it will be formed into an autocratic repression repressive state. So I saw there as a reason that these people will suffer anyway if they lose.
And you mentioned some other conflicts, which is Afghanistan. You participated in these as part of military. You have no experience volunteering for other militaries or organizations, because many legionnaires, for example, volunteered for the LAPG in Kurdistan. So do you have any such experience as well?
No, not before. All my missions before was in a military context, and this is completely volunteered. It was like out of my own motivation, on my own risk, just joining something. It was a big step. It was like a jump into water, like we say. I just did it. So it was not like a huge background which caused this or helped by that.
How did your family and friends react to this choice of yours to volunteer for the military in Ukraine, and how did it impact your relationship with them? Were they supportive?
More or less. For some, it was really, some didn't really understand, some expected it, it was difficult. Different also between different individuals. Some know that this possibility could happen. Others was completely shocked by it. It was really individual and really different. So there is not a straight answer to it.
So would you say there was a bit of a disconnect with some people that didn't really understand what the gravity of the situation is, and why would you?
So everyone understood why and for which cause I do it, and everyone understood this and thought this was a good reason. But that I do it, I have to do it by myself, to put myself into this risk, that was not understandable for closer people like family also. So that was more the issue, not the cause.
Okay. If you feel comfortable, can you share some examples? If not, that's fine as well. Because many people might be interested in this, especially those who want to volunteer for the Legion, or considering themselves and how to deal with maybe misunderstandings or with relationships and friends and etc.
Yeah, the most issues I had was the most people, especially those who had no military background, have a lack of knowledge what could happen, how it could happen. And if someone say he's going there, joining this fight, for example, the most people don't know that only a certain percentage of a whole army is fighting. So not necessarily if you join an army doesn't necessarily mean that you are directly standing on the front line. You could be also in a support role or something. For some people who don't know such informations, they creating really fast the worst case scenario in their head, and then it's a clear communication is really the key to prevent having other people's issues with this decision.
So how did you prepare after you made the decision that you're going to volunteer for the Legion? How did you prepare here? What was the process like? What are some tips you can share? How was it?
How I prepared, it was dealing my paperwork to say it straight. It was dealing with my employee, that I could leave or that I have a chance to go back, all my insurances and stuff like this. Then, of course, the first idea everyone has if it comes to preparation is equipment and so on. But the real issues is sorting out your private life, also the communication, how you can keep up the communication with other people, how you deal with your financial and work life during this time, but also for after this time. You have to calculate this, and deal with this, and then maybe also comes to equipment and travel, how you travel there, what do you take with you, and so on. Yeah. For example, I just grabbed some leftover stuff I had from my military career, like old uniforms, plate carrier, helmet, and so on. In the end, it's hard to say what you really need in that situation. You grab what you have and go, and after a while you see that you did half of it, you don't need it, but you need other stuff. So regards equipment, you have to reassess it after a while.
Is there anything you wish you'd done different before leaving? Or was it overall good?
Yeah, maybe deal with the communication channels before I arrived there, because communication out of an area like this to family is not easy, and you can't do it frequently, but to involve these people straight ahead and take them on board how it is and how it will be. This could be what I do different the next time.
And did any of your friends, especially your comrades from the military, also choose to volunteer for the war in Ukraine? Or were you the only one from the people you know personally? Do you cooperate in any way?
Not from those I directly know. I'm the only one, but also I didn't told everyone what I'm doing. So, yeah.
So the first few months of the war were obviously very chaotic, and Ukraine never dealt with anything like a foreign legion before, and was very, very new to the country, and also amidst the invasion, it was very crazy time. And what was your experience when you first arrived in Ukraine? What was it like? What was going through your head? What did you feel? How well was everything organized?
It was organized. It was not a vacuum of organization. It had some structures and so on. That was okay. Of course, it was a huge mixture of people, and everything was a little bit under pressure. There was this immediate threat, and it was like everyone tried to form units and train in the shortest time frame possible. And this was like, this happens in every organization. If you start something on the run, under pressure, it needs a few turns until it runs fluently. So the first runs was a little bit chaotic and really pushed fast until they found the organization structure and the processes to do it right. I think right now it's way better than back then, but it's like normal, happens under the circumstances.
And for our viewers, maybe a little bit more interested on the personal level, like what was going through your head when you first arrived? I don't know, Poland or Moldova. What was your first impression? Like, I'm here now. I'm seeing other people also coming to volunteer. Like, just maybe you share your personal experience rather than the situation of the whole.
Yeah, it was like, I didn't know exactly what to expect. It was like I go in blank and see what's gonna happen. And I was picked up by different volunteers groups who drive me from one point to another, to the barracks and so on, where I meet other volunteers, and after a short while, those small groups formed by themselves until you arrived in a bigger scale. So I was actually surprised how helpful everyone was. And it was like, I don't know what's going on, what's going to happen. It was more like a little bit curiosity. But it ran in the end somehow.
And what was the mood like? What was the atmosphere? Was it like uplifting? Was everybody very motivated? or it's a first peer-on-peer conflict, how not an insurgency or anything else. So how were people feeling when they were coming in?
Yeah.
A lot of nervousness, a lot of fear or excitement, maybe courage. What do you think? What did you experience?
Yeah, a lot of people was very excited about something unknown, also something new. But of course, there was also the big question marks in which direction this travel will lead. Yeah, because it was like, there was a constant lack of language. There was a lot of language barriers. So you have to check sometimes twice, or to know what's going on or where you go, and but in the end it works all out. But that was like excitement, but also a little bit of doubt where you go to, because you just drive into the unknown. So mostly from places you never heard of to other places you never heard of, and and you have to find out the experience through this language. You have to experience what's you got to expect through this language barrier. That was a little bit difficult at the beginning, but after a while it sorted way better out.
And what can you tell us about the other volunteers that you met? What does an average legionnaire look like? What was their motivation? What were their nationalities? Did most people have combat experience? Just a general profile of the people you've met.
There was a huge variety of people. The majority had combat experience. I met volunteers from almost all possible countries, from different South African states, South American states, or a lot of from Canada, USA, Great Britain, some Asian countries like Taiwan, Sri Lanka, and so on, and really all states from Europe, even Switzerland, and a lot of from the Eastern European countries. Was everything involved. The majority of them has had a military background or even experience in missions in the past, like, for example, Afghanistan, very prominent. But also a little part of the volunteers was just unexperienced adventurers who just came there, but they are really fast sorted out. So after the first few days, everyone was assessed about their capabilities, if he can do this. Such people didn't come far. So some people tried to create a little adventure for themselves or their Instagram account, I don't know, but these people didn't came far if they lack of a proper experience or background and the skill set they could contribute to the cause.
So you would say the adventurers got sorted out pretty quickly, and the ones that were left, what was their main driving motivation? Was it once again the same for you as defending the people, defending democracy, or maybe something I've heard from other volunteers from Eastern Europe, that they personally feel like some animosity towards Russia, like in Finland and Poland? What would you say is the main motivation you've witnessed? There's of course a little bit different. I mean, even individual, if you ask 20 guys, you definitely have to find 20 different opinions. So but in general, was a lot of countries, people from countries who had already bad experience with the Russians, for example, Georgians, Chechens, and so on, who came there to continue or
exile Belarusians, so a lot of them, to continue their fight against the Russians on another area. A lot of Eastern European people, like from the Baltics also, who know from their history that this could become really bad for them if it's continue in their direction. And from the Western states, when I can call them now here like this, it's more like, especially like Central Europe, Germany, France, Britain, USA, Spain, and so on, Italians, Portuguese, I meant, or the Scandinavians, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, and so on, Finland. It was more like they had this military experience. They felt the probability that they can do something, and felt this injustice which just happens, and that was a main motivation for them to do something. You know, it's, yeah, actually pretty similar like me, but every time with an individual note. Yeah.
And you mentioned a little bit about the Georgians and the Chechens. Were they involved mostly with the other volunteers, or were they sort of in their separate battalions, like the Georgian Legion and the, I believe it's Johar Dudayev battalion? Were they with you, or were they separate?
Depends. On some instances, they formed their own units. In the beginning, there was a lot of mix up between such groups, but some groups who worked already before or came from a certain area, it makes sense that they form their own teams or battalions don't work with these language barriers. Among the other volunteers, the main language was English, which was not every time easy for everyone. Not everyone had the same language skills and language level, and so in some circumstances it makes sense that they formed their own units, which was what happens, especially, for example, if you had a lot of people out of one area, like the Belarusians, Georgians, Chechens, and so on.
And how do you generally feel about the other volunteers? Do you feel like you can trust them, you can work with them, they were professional, most of them at least? What was the general feeling towards each other? A lot of people from very different backgrounds, always.
Yeah, it was mostly at the beginning a little careful approach, because it's a completely stranger, mostly, yeah. But there's a common interest and a common cause, so that's already a base where everyone understands each other. And after a while, you get warmed up with the most of them. As I said, you have this common interest where you already start to build up some interactions, some communication with each other. And especially if you spend a lot of time, weeks or months with them, or share the same experience, the relation between these people get way deeper.
So, as far as I understand, the command of the Legion is Ukrainian. The commanders are from the Ukrainian military.
Exactly, yeah.
And what was your impression of their professionalism, their skill set? Generally, what's your impression of the Ukrainian command of the Legion?
It was actually totally different depending on which one was in charge. Could be a good one, could be a bad one, depended completely on the person itself. I had luck so far, so I hadn't any bigger problems. It depends. There was a lot of different mindsets, especially in the officer ranks of the Ukrainian army. You had some really old school officers with this old straight Soviet style leadership style, and more modern minded guys who had these more NATO-like leadership in their mind. So it depended on the person. I switched a few times the teams. So I was on 4 different teams. So I saw a little bit different styles of leadership, but that was not the main reason why I changed the teams. It was mostly I had better connection to other team members who was another task and area of operation where I could fit better with my skill set. And so we found after a while the teams together for the best way they could operate together.
And what was the training process like? Did you receive any additional training, or were you the one giving training?
Both. Actually, both. It was more like we had at the beginning like a physical test and a test of our skill set. Then we had a short instruction on the equipment we could get provided and what we used. But because we was already all trained military guys, it was more like our training was more focused on ourselves to get our team to a certain standard that we can use our own skills in a common practice. Yeah, so that we speak the same language, that we use the same signs, that we have the same procedures. So that was the most difficult. The rest was like we was already all trained military professionals, and that wasn't a problem.
And you mentioned several times there was a lot of people from a lot of different countries with different levels of experience. How exactly did they get allocated into units? What was the logic? How did this process work? Was it more on your initiative or the commanders?
There was a lot of different aspects to it. Sometimes it depends when you arrived and when you join, that units get formed at this certain moment, or that you got already contact to the certain units and could join them directly, or was like if you know the leader of some units, like the officer, and got recommended because of your certain skill set. For example, I was in mechanized infantry, so it was make more sense to join a unit who had mechanized vehicles than to a unit who hasn't. So there was a lot of communication between different groups, different units, and a lot of exchange of people until you found a group who could work at best together.
And another thing is, were you present at the Yavoriv base in the Lviv Oblast? And also, were you present there during the missile attack, which was very much reported in the news and garnered a lot of attention?
I was at that base, but not at this time. I joined a few weeks later, so I saw still the damage and so on, but I wasn't directly there during the attack.
Do you know many people who were?
Actually, yes, yeah.
And did they share their experience with you? Was it a big impact on the motivation? Did a lot of people leave, or was everyone still ready to keep going?
It was more like a change in their professional behavior, because all this attack was caused by a lack of information security. And after this was like a huge topic amongst everyone. And there was a lot of rules changed after that, especially for those foreigners who just joined, that they aren't so visible in different online sources, because that was a huge mistake they made back then.
And when did you first see combat in Ukraine? What did you think at the moment? What did you feel? How did it compare to your previous experience?
Yeah, it was around beginning of July. So as I mentioned, I get later into the country. I wasn't straight there from the start. I was joined in April, and then I was participating in different courses and supply positions. So was training with different units on mechanized vehicles and so on, and organization and supply tasks. But in July I was joining a unit, actual combat unit, and it was actually pretty different to what we experienced in the past in stabilization operations like in Afghanistan. It was like a full-scale war. There was a lot of artillery going on, which is not commonly used in stabilization operations, and this was expected but new, but also a lot of new aspects of warfare, like the density of drone usage and so on, was actually pretty new. And the problem most people had is when they expect to join such a combat unit is that they expect a classic gunfight, like shooting each other, which is not the cause. It's more like it's really rare. And the majority of the warfare is dealt by, yeah, I would say large machines like artillery, tanks, planes, and not so much on foot with a rifle in the hand.
And obviously, a lot of the volunteers, as we discussed, were from ex-NATO military.
Yeah.
And did they have a big? Did they show off maybe a difference from what they are used to, how war is, and the operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, and how it turned out to be in Ukraine? Was that a big, or from what you observed, was it a big difference for them? Were they surprised, or was everybody prepared for this level of intensity?
Yeah, as I said, it's this form of warfare wasn't done since decades, even for NATO countries. And yeah, the most people are actually surprised by this scale and of warfare and how it's really done, the intensity. So in Afghanistan, for example, like the most people had experience from, it's like smaller clashes, smaller firefights, a lot of IED situation and so on, but that you're in actual combat between complete battalions of artillery shooting each other, or tanks clashing into each other, that's almost new for almost everyone.
And did most volunteers persevere through this difficulty, or were many people surprised and just decided to stop for them?
A small percentage definitely decided to stop after their first impression. Some have to get used to it. Most of them, as I said, was mostly surprised by this, have to get used to it first. Definitely if you couldn't deal with it and stopped, which is a good right as a volunteer, so they did, but the majority kept on going. So it's only maybe 2, 3, 4% dropped out later.
Was everyone free to leave when they wanted? Was there any problems with that?
So as long you are under contract, you're part of the military, but as a volunteer, you got the option to break this contract and leave again. You can do this theoretically all the time, probably not directly if you're in an ongoing operation, then it could be difficult. When you're straight in a firefight, you can't just drop your rifle and say, I break my contract, I'll leave. It's a little bit more difficult than that, but generally you can break your contract and leave.
So yeah, one interesting thing, one of the other legionnaires told me is that a lot of the people in his experience that were ex-military in NATO but never saw any combat, never went on deployment, they actually performed worse than like people with very little experience at all in the army when it came to like artillery and etc. because they were so used to just very comfortable service. And what was this similar in your experience in generally? Like, what was the patterns of like who performed better, who performed worse? Was there any like recognizable, patterns to it?
Hard to generalize. I know that there is a lot of certain mindset and structure solid in some guys' heads from certain armies and so on. So definitely military experience was better than no experience, so any kind. What I faced was the experience that those guys who came from armies which don't have a lot of financial or material background performed better than those from bigger, larger armies, because these guys are more used to deal with lack of equipment, lack of supply, instead of those guys from larger armies who are get used to supply everything they wish or have every support they want. And those guys perform way better because they are used to cope with shortings of ammunition, of shortings of fuel, shortings of air or fire support. That was the experience I had.
And can you tell us a little bit about the missions you've participated in personally? What kind of work you do?
It was mostly like mostly targeted operations, mostly like small scale attacks, small scale ambushes, stuff like this. So as I said, we was in our unit with mechanized forces, armored vehicles, and so on. So we was acted more like a shock troop. We surveillance some certain areas, looking for weak points, and if the enemy doesn't expect it, we assaulted smaller targets like certain forest, certain small village, certain outpost of the Russians, and try to take it back or just to cause as many damage we could in a short time frame.
So would you say generally it's moving more towards small team tactics warfare, or are there still this huge mechanized assaults, and or are that mix of both?
I witnessed both of it, so I couldn't speak for everything. So.
And did you ever come into direct contact with the Russian soldiers where the enemy is visible? And what if yes, what went through your head at this moment? What did it feel like?
Interestingly, I never get so close to the Russians like we are right now. This whole conflict was fought on large distances. Yeah, so like on artillery distance, the majority of firefight is through artillery, where you don't see your target at all. Or if you even do assaults like we did with our vehicles, it's more like also there we tried to shoot on the maximum distance we could. So it was never so close so that I could have spoken with them or something like this.
So some of the other soldiers reported that the Russians really prefer to just pull back when they encounter resistance and just shell with artillery until it's clear, and only then they will approach. Is that also in your experience the same?
Yeah, it's one of the favorite weapons of the Russians is definitely artillery. They use it a lot, as much as they could. Also mines. Artillery and mines is what that we faced the most from the Russian side. They mine almost everything and shell almost everything. So
And what was your general impression of the Russian army, their level of professionalism, their equipment?
Really mixed, really mixed. There was really high professional forces, and then there was also really bad experienced, bad equipped forces. So it depends every time on which forces you are facing. So especially after the mobilization, the quality of the personal training on the Russian side was shifting downwards a lot. But then they had some specialized or elite troops who are really highly trained or highly equipped and performed really well and really difficult operations, which we sometimes didn't imagine. But then you have some really bad equipped Mobics or these guys from the Donetsk Republic or some who are have really bad training, bad equipment on bad tactics, and just suffers a lot if they're attacking Ukrainian positions. So it's hard to generalize. It depends on the opponent.
And what about the way the Russians conduct themselves towards civilians? Have you personally seen any of the atrocities, any of mistreatments committed? Or was this not something you witnessed yourself?
Not ongoing, but in the aftermath. So in the liberated villages, we saw some dead civilians. We often saw a lot of destroyed civil infrastructure. We could use a lot of infrastructure by our own, because in some villages a lot of houses were empty because the villagers are either way forced to flee, deported, or dead. So that was a huge impression, because we came sometimes in villages who were in majority completely empty from people, not only during the combat but in general, due to the whatever they did in this time, where they're, as I said, the people are either way fled or got killed or something like that.
And after your experience in Ukraine, what do you feel towards Russian soldiers? Are you indifferent to them, or do you have a certain animosity, hatred, even maybe empathy for those who don't want to be there? How do you feel toward them?
That's a really difficult question, I would say. Definitely no empathy, but I would also don't say hate. It's more like, I don't fight them because I hate them. It's more like a necessity. Of course, I have huge hatred for those who commit these war crimes. But it's hard to tell who did something like this. This is like, this has to be, found out who did what, but this is not our task. When I see them as enemy soldiers, and there's a reason to fight them, and that's it, mostly. Yeah. But I wouldn't say that I hate them in general. I mean, I still have hope that there are some Russians who maybe could resist against this system in their own country, but there's a small hope. And so far, until this happens, I see the necessity to resist them.
So you have hope that Russia will change the country in the process?
Yeah, as I said, it's a really small hope. Right now, it's not visible, and a lot of people in Russia itself are oppressed. Yeah, it's, as I said, a hope in the future that they could change Russia from inside, but that would be the best case. It's hard to hope on the best case. So,
There are many anecdotal reports on the internet of the Russian armed forces allegedly leaving the wounded soldiers behind and not even caring a lot to get them back. Would you say this is true in your experience, or is this an exaggeration?
I wouldn't say it's true, but also wouldn't say it's false. So it depends every time on the context, on the unit and the area. What we witnessed was like they tried to evacuate their wounded, but if they're in a hurry, and this is usual what could happen in combat situations, if they have to pull back, they leave the dead. That's definitely what I can agree on. And yeah, and it depends. Also, if they have to retreat hastily, they leave back what's hinders, block them. So like damaged equipment, dead soldiers, and so. And they focus on more what they can use in the future and wounded soldiers and so on. Wounded soldiers depends if they're really overwhelmed in a certain situation, maybe, but that they left them back in the general, I couldn't tell that.
What about the Russian morale? Would you say it's high?
I see they are lacking way more, especially during the cold weather. But then it's also, like I said before, it depends on the unit. If the unit well equipped, well supported, and there are definitely units who are really hard indoctrinated, they are probably don't have any issues with morale. The most morale issues, say, we focus was like among these lesser good equipped and trained units, like from the LNR, DNR, the mobilized forces, these Rosgardia forces, who are more like, in general, poor infantry, but they have lack of motivation, definitely, and they have facing huge problems, especially if they are not well equipped during the cold weather.
And do you have any experience with Russian soldiers surrendering? How often does it happen? Have you captured anyone yourself?
No, not during my time. I didn't had any one surrender to my unit, or I had experience of this. I heard something like this from other units, where even people handed over equipment and so on, but we wasn't often constantly in one area of operations, so probably it's way more possible on units who are constantly in the same area that they witness something like this way more often than we are.
And do you often interact with the regular Ukrainian military? And if yes, what is your impression of them, their level of professionalism, and also their morale?
Yeah, we had frequent contact to the Ukrainian military. Definitely, as soon as we get into an operation area, we have to contact the Ukrainian military in this area, but also we often attach to other Ukrainian units where we're working with. So there was a constant exchange, and the morale of them was mostly very high, and the training was mostly way better than, for example, on the Russian side. Even if they are fast, mobilized, and had only sometimes training for 2 or 3 weeks, what happened, especially at the beginning of a war. But afterwards, if they have a good leader, they try to train them more and gathering more experience. and we had a lot of exchange between our units and other Ukrainian units, so that we had train each other on new equipment or tactics. So there was a frequent exchange to enhance capabilities.
And how would you comment on the difference between the Russian and the Ukrainian way of waging warfare? What are the main differences? What are some similarities maybe in the way the two militaries interact?
I think the main difference is the mindset, that the Ukrainians managed to get rid of these old, in the majority of this old Soviet mindset of warfare, and going more to a more flexible, more proactive mindset for what, like in Western standard, that every unit has their own hierarchy, their own leadership, and their own responsibility. So they have to act in this frame and act for the best result. And on the Russian side, it was more this old, strict hierarchy, Soviet style. If some higher ranking said something, the units stand there for days, weeks, months until this higher ranking officers say something else. So it's very unflexible. So the Ukrainian side, with this mindset, had it way more easy to implement new tactics, new technologies, and use it to the most effect. Instead, on the other side, the Russians, with this really strict, limited flexibility of their units.
And what about Ukrainian civilians? Are they supportive? What's your experience with interacting with them where they were present?
The majority is very supportive. So we had a lot of support, especially when it comes to accommodation or food and something like this. They helped us a lot for this. In certain areas, we needed to be careful because especially in some recent reoccupied areas, there was a lot of doubt that or suspicion that there could be some former collaborators still left behind. So we've been way more careful in such areas, but the majority was very friendly.
Do you have maybe any memorable moments with the civilians that you want to share, or something that left an impression on you?
Yeah, we had a lot of, as I said before, if we are in such areas that we got accommodated by locals, then often form the neighborhoods form small groups who supplied us with food frequently, with hot meals and so on. So a lot of local women often formed small groups where they, in a frequent term, everyone was cooking for us or something like this. And so we got really good supplied by this way. So they showed a lot of gratitude on this way. So, yeah.
And in Ukraine, ever since the war in Donbass in 2014, the civilian volunteer community has been very prominent. And you can say that in the first years of the war in Donbass, the civilians actually the civilian volunteers provided more support for the army than the government back then. And obviously now the situation in 2022 is much different. The Ukrainian military was much more prepared, but still there's this huge civilian volunteer community, which is like something very unique from the historic standpoint. Do you yourself have experience interacting with the civilian volunteers, maybe helping you get equipment, supporting you with food, etc.? I mean, not the civilians just in the area, but the organizations.
Yeah, on an organization level, yeah, definitely understand you. I had some experience with such groups who supported us not only due to fundraising for certain equipment, but gathering equipment for us like clothings, camouflage clothes. So most of us, our volunteers, came there, especially those from overseas, only with the luggage which fits in a plane. Yeah, so we needed often some support gathering some clothes like camouflage uniforms, plate carriers, helmets. There we got a lot of support from such groups. But also when it comes to more expensive equipment, they sometimes gathered for reconnaissance drones or night vision equipment. But there are the possibilities limited because these stuff is really expensive and need a lot of funds to get raised. So yeah.
Any specific organizations you interacted with that you can recall, or not really?
We had some people raising for us from this Save Life group, Ukraine, I think they was calling.
Maybe Come Back Alive? Or?
Yeah, Come Back Alive. They did us. We had some volunteers in Kiev who gathered former NATO uniforms and so on. They don't had a strict direct name. It was more like a still forming group. They gathered used uniforms from all around Europe, like old French uniforms, old British uniforms, washed them, sorted them, handed them back out to volunteers and so on. There we got a lot of help.
Okay. And what is your opinion on the Russian military equipment? Are they mostly using Soviet stuff, or are there like modern pieces like T-90M or something? Have you encountered any such thing?
It's a really strange mix. The majority they use is Soviet stuff. They have huge stockpiles on Soviet weapons, Soviet ammunitions. So the majority of artillery shells and ammunition rounds and so they fired was mostly really at least 30, 40 years old or something like this, but still working. Some newer equipment, but that's on a small scale. So we faced often more modern vehicles like in the area we was working, a lot of T-80 tanks, Tiger armored vehicles, Ka-52 helicopters, and especially on the guns they used some of these modern Peshenek machine guns, AK-12, RSG, grenade launchers, and so on. So that's a bit more modern stuff. Yeah, but otherwise they used really old uniforms, old ammunitions, old weapons, body armor. Really old body armor we faced, which looked like they used it already in Afghanistan or so. Stuff like that. But even there, the majority is back equipped. Then you have some special units who have all this fancy stuff.
So one thing I was personally wondering about is the performance of the Russian Air Force, because on paper it seems like it's one of the biggest fleets of fixed-wing aircraft in the world, but in Ukraine we don't see it being used very often, at least in what you see in the media and in different news sites. Is this so in your experience? And if it is, why do you think is the Russian Air Force so underperforming?
Yeah, good point. I was also wondering while I was there why they are so rarely seen. When we see them, it depended every time on how good the anti-air capabilities of the Ukrainian units in this area was. I was in areas where the Russian army was like nothing, not at all operating, because there was some Ukrainian anti-air units present. And then you had areas where we witnessed some attacks of these Kf-52 helicopters from the Russians, because they could fly in really fast and got not a lot of anti-air counterfire. So, but in general, it's not so much. But I think we think they are on a wrong scale, because especially in the NATO countries, we are used by the omnipresent air force of our forces, especially if you talk about the Americans or British or France or so. You use a lot of air power, but the Russian Air Force is more like it's operating on a more specific way, and the most combat support they do with artillery, and there was a lot of it. But also, when you try to do deep strike attacks, so into the country, the majority is not done by planes, but by cruise missiles. And sometimes they shoot these cruise missiles from their large bombers to give the Ukrainians a shorter reaction time. So every time they use their air power, it's mostly in a very specific role. So I witnessed only a few helicopter attacks and a few bomb drops from fixed wing aircraft, so we call it.
Have you seen a lot of Western supplied equipment on the battlefield? Have you interacted with it? Is it having a big impact?
A lot, actually, yeah, a lot. Especially armored vehicles, like the American MRAPs or the British MRAPs. Of course, all the handguns, we used mostly Western handguns and ammunitions and anti-tank weapons and so on. It's a weird mixture of this Ukrainian homemade stuff, Western stuff, and old Soviet stuff. And yeah, especially when it comes to anti-air equipment, there was the Western stuff really helpful. Units around us used a lot of Stingers, which prevented a lot of these helicopter attacks. We saw a lot of Western artillery in action, which helped a lot. And yeah, we used some of these MRAPs, which was great. But there's also a lot of lack in some areas of equipment. For example, we had these APCs, but no Western IFVs, so fighting vehicles like or like BMPs or tanks and so on. This is mostly still Soviet stuff. Yeah, but what was delivered had definitely a huge impact.
Would you say Western governments are delivering enough of weapons, or would you like to see more? And which specific weapons do you think are a priority right now to be delivered? I think it's really good that there's stuff delivered. This was really a really helpful thing. Otherwise, the situation would be way more dire. Also, it could be more. Especially artillery systems and counter-artillery systems are a really huge point which is needed. Artillery ammunition, because this conflict is burning through a lot of ammunition. Anti-air equipment, which is important against these cruise missiles, but also against the Air Force itself. Electronic warfare. Electronic warfare is a huge point, which many people don't recognize.
the Russians use a lot of electronic warfare where they're jamming all the radios and communication measurements. There are not a lot of countermeasures from the Ukrainian side at the moment. They try. They don't have so much like the Russians. The Russians have more drone equipment, of course. Yeah, and of course, and then definitely armored mechanized vehicles like tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and so on, because the fight is done by huge distances with a lot of artillery. If you want to go from one target to another, you have to cross a no man's land where you're just in range of artillery. And if you don't do this under the protection of an armored vehicle, you find yourself in artillery fire. It's a huge difficulty.
Yeah, moving away a little bit from the equipment and more towards the human side, how would you describe the war in Ukraine to someone in the West who has been living their entire life in peace, so that they understand?
Oh, that's a complicated question. It's hard to explain because it's hard to imagine such circumstances where everything is destroyed. And yeah, also this conflict is like, it happens on different scales. So if you're close to the front, it's like a total war. Everything could be destroyed, everything could be shot by artillery. But if you're further away from the front line, normal life is keep going on, but still there's a constant threat of these long-range weapons like cruise missiles, who are often targeted at cities and so on. So there's a constant threat of existence. So, and it's hard to explain something like this.
Did it make you look at life differently, would you say?
Definitely, yeah. I can't exactly tell how, but I think it will definitely shift my attitude from in certain perspectives of something. Yeah.
Does it feel much different being here now?
Yeah, it's definitely different, yeah.
Could you share what was the most horrible thing you witnessed during the war? What was the most, like, that left a bad impact on you? What is the...
Definitely to see that so much civilians also get targeted. Yeah, so especially in the villages on the front line, where you had all these execution of civilians or suspected military men or higher ranking civil personnel, and where we've also found these mass graves and so on. But also it's difficult to describe because it's so weird in some kinds how and what was attacked. For example, with these cruise missiles that you expect on a military scale, that you try to attack high value targets with it from the beginning on, like military bases, power plants, infrastructure like bridges or train stations and so on. And then it's not happening, but instead they just hit randomly some civil infrastructure like cities also. It's hard to understand why. It's like it makes like a totally random impression, like no further plan, but it's like a constant terror. Yeah.
And on a different note, what was the most wonderful thing you've seen during your time there? Something that like gave you hope and inspired you, maybe something good.
As I mentioned before, we worked with some of these volunteer groups, and it was really inspiring how these people, mostly younger people, as long as they don't serve in a military context already, formed these small solidaric groups and worked together very enthusiastically. It was actually pretty inspiring. Yeah.
And have you personally witnessed any examples of heroic actions by your direct comrades or the Ukrainian military, or something that really left an impression on you?
Phew. That's a really hard question, because you have every time an individual point of view on something like this. Sometimes maybe I don't see something like other people would call heroic, but because I got used to such military context and stuff and work, but I was actually sometimes really impressed how long some people lasted in their positions, like literally trenches and holes in the dirt for weeks and weeks going on a constant attacks, constant fire, which is like really hard. And I think it's not easy to understand what kind of pressure these people are in. And that's definitely something not ordinary.
So the low intensity conflict that America has been involved in the Middle East, such as Afghanistan and Iraq, have really brought attention to the issue of PTSD to society. And for example, many more Americans died due to suicide than combat in Afghanistan, for example. Many more soldiers, yes. And the scale of war in Ukraine is unimaginably larger, and the intensity is much higher. And I just wanted to ask, how is it impacting your comrades and yourself psychologically, and how are you guys dealing with this?
So far, I didn't witness something like this, but the problem with such issues is that they are not directly visible. It could be also come up or facing in the long term. So it's hard to tell right now. Because right now, if you are active and are in this work and in this group, probably something doesn't come up, which does come up if you're in a completely other context with your thoughts and minds alone about this issue. So I think that will be a big topic in the future, bigger than right now, and yeah, there will definitely something come up.
So obviously, real war is very different from films or games or books or wherever in the media we see it. But just out of curiosity, would you say there was any moment where you saw something and you said, "Well, that's just like it was in the movies"? Are there any such moment? Or is it just completely different?
I don't like to compare something to movies. I know, as I said, I had already a lot of military experience, and I know that the majority in movies is not realistic. And yeah, but the thing, what you never can really describe really in a movie or in a book even is sometimes how slow and sometimes how fast war is going on. So it's really, we spend a lot of time of waiting and holding a position and nothing happens, and planning something and nothing really happens, and then you have happen everything at all half day at once, and after that it's quiet again, and it's so surreal. It's hard to describe. So that's something the most people can't imagine. If you talk about war, it's like a constant, ongoing action, but sometimes you're just sitting there and not much. Something is happened, but not much, and then you have an operation, and a lot happens. Yeah.
Just a contrast.
Yeah, the contrast there.
And how would you say the Legion evolved over the past 9 months? Were there any major changes to how it's functioning?
Yeah, it changed a lot of in their procedures, in their organization. It changed a lot. Also, of course, with the people, it's like, as I said, it's mostly volunteers. They don't stay there from the beginning till the end of the war. So you have a constant flow of people working there, and they're shifting their operations sometimes. Of course, they are also in the areas where the main focus are, but also operating with the TDF units and supporting them, training them, something like this. Yeah, I think it's a constant change, so I can't even tell where the focus is right now.
And what do you think the future holds for the Legion? How do you think it will look? What are the trends? More people coming in, less people, more professional people, better coordination. Just what do you think the future is?
I think it really depends on how present this conflict is in the media and the mindset of every other country. Yeah, we could really see that there's a different interest of people joining the Legion with different news in the media. Like after the huge successes of Ukraine, you had way more volunteers joining in, but also if everything gets, for example, right now it's cold and quiet, that's not for everyone to fight. So you have a lot of less people right now. So you have constant changes there. And I think the media presence is a key element also for that.
So you would say the media side of the war is also very important, especially for the recruitment.
Yeah, definitely.
And personally, how would you say you changed during these 9 months of war? Do you think there's any major changes to you? How you see everything?
Yeah, I think I became a lot way more pragmatic, even in military topics or private topics. It doesn't matter. I think I see it way more. Yeah, focus on getting stuff done either way under the given circumstances than complaining about it.
Anything else?
Not right now. So.
What would you say are some lessons from the war, both for you personally, for the society in the West, and for the Western militaries?
Yeah, I think it was like a huge wake-up call, because, as I said at the beginning, I was shocked that something like this could happen, because we totally forgot that this is like a tool of diplomatic processes every nation has in their equipment, but we totally forgot that this is possible, and we didn't believe that this could happen. But it doesn't every time depend on us. Only because we don't want it, something like this happens doesn't mean that the opposite side won't do it. Yeah, so this is like like this old saying, if you want peace, you have to prepare for war. Like this dilemma, yeah. So, and we now see that we aren't prepared. The most Western nations totally forgot to prepare for some cases like this, because we lived in hopes and dreams in the past about something like this.
Could you offer some advice for people who would want to join the Legion in the coming future?
Advice, okay. Yeah, try definitely to get some contact first. Yeah, get contact to the Legion. Right now they have way better websites than when I started, so there are also already some possibilities to get some contact, and definitely ask your specific questions beforehand. And yeah.
With the onset of winter, how do you expect the war to change?
I think there's a huge there's a huge gap of mobility then. So what we saw in the past is mobile warfares in the offensives are probably not possible anymore right now, especially in the cold, in the mud, and so on. In some areas where you don't have good roads, you can't just attack through these open fields and in these muddy conditions where you probably get stuck and in the end ending as a sitting target. So a lot of combat will be focused on static fixed roads, and the rest will be fought mostly in artillery range. So in such systems who got more embedded systems on this would have probably the better cards in a sense. Yeah.
So who do you think the winter is going to favor?
Difficult to say. It depends a little bit on the support from the Western nations for Ukraine. So as I said, artillery is one of the main weapons for the Russians. They will use it a lot. They will try to hold the ground they captured and prevent recapturing with a huge screen of artillery fire. And to break this, the Ukrainian needs way better, way more modern artillery system than the Russians have to counter this. So, and then it depends a little bit how much systems they got delivered from the West, how much ammunition for this they got delivered. Yeah, this would be a key factor in my opinion.
Having spent a considerable amount of time in Ukraine, what do you think about the country's people and the country itself?
It's a huge country. It's a really huge country compared to Western nations here. It's everything happens in distances you are not used here. So the borders are extremely long. The Ukrainians have to cover with Belarus and Russia, and also the distance you have to fight over. So if you want to cross an open field, this could be a distance like an agricultural field. Could be a distance already from 3, 4, 5 kilometers. Yeah, this is a huge problem for operations. Otherwise, the country actually has a huge variety to it. So with the coast in the south and these huge areas in the north and east, you have large cities, and then you have for a while nothing else than really, really small villages. So everything is really crammed on the population, mostly to the urban areas. And then you have a lot of empty space, which you are mostly not used in European nations like this here. This is a huge difference.
But just from the civilian standpoint, like about the culture, about your interactions with the people, just general, what's your impression? As far as I understand, you haven't been to Ukraine before that.
Yeah. Of course, you have, like in every former Soviet Union country, this reminiscence of Soviet infrastructure, of Soviet behavior, and so on. But it's strongly fading away. Especially in the younger generations, they're really open to modern ideas, modern technologies, modern way of life, and so on. In some certain aspects, they're even way further than we are here in Germany. So the usage of modern medias, they use a lot of them to integrate it in their work life and to their own benefit. Way more braver than we are here, for example. We are way slower regard this. The Ukrainians are often focused. They are more curious about such technologies and how they can use them, and they just do it. So, yeah. So this is definitely one point which impressed me really much. Otherwise, they are, especially the younger generations I work with, are really open. Yeah, they try to enhance their language skills mostly towards English, and try to get are open to the whole world, to get ideas from there, to get the possibility to work internationally, especially even if they work with internet-related jobs. They try to work from their homeland with corporations in all the world.
So what would you think the future holds for Ukraine as a nation? From your experience there, what do you think? Is the future bright?
They have a lot of potential. It depends now on how this war will work out, how they can use this potential. Because if this runs out in favor of Ukraine, Ukraine could be like a potential good partner for European nations in the East. And they have good potential for this, and they're starting from a point where they can build a lot new. So hard it sounds right now, but as history showed us, this could lead sometimes to something really good.
Do you see yourself in Ukraine after the war is over? Generally, what are your plans for the future?
I will definitely go back there. So I know now a lot of people there. I know really few beautiful places. So I don't know exactly, but I will at least visit it a few times more.
In general, for yourself, do you intend to continue with this, other maybe military volunteering in the future, or would you say this is enough for you, and once this is done, you would like to not go back to that anymore?
I hope so. I actually don't want to do this again, but I also said this last time, so I don't know.
What did you miss about home while you were in Ukraine? Specifically, something that you thought about a lot?
Of course, different certain structures which I'm used to use. A lot of friends, of course, definitely friends, family, but also by the step I choose to go there, I totally left the comfort zone, like of net of fixed structures you live in a Western society here, of a job, income, insurances. So a lot of securities are left behind. That's not the first thing you think about when you do something like this, but definitely as soon you miss them, you miss us a lot. So to leave that behind is a huge step. And yeah, I think, I somehow miss that, but also it's somehow liberating. It's a liberating feeling to move a little bit outside of something like this.
And now that you're back for a couple of weeks, are you treating life here any differently? Do you feel the society is different? Do you have any new insights into what it is like?
Probably I noticed a few changes on myself that I'm often as I said, I'm thinking now way more pragmatic. So I get way more often impatient if some people living in this in their everyday life and doesn't notice that there is a way easier and direct way to do something, but they do it because they did it every time the same and don't think about another way to do it. That's something happened to me a lot here. I noticed that I think a little bit different about something like that.
So you would say it brought out the pragmatism in you?
Yeah, definitely.
And what do you think the response of the German and Western society and government to this for? Do you think it's been sufficient or insufficient? How do you evaluate it? And do you think they understand the gravity of the situation? Are they doing enough?
Oh, that's a huge topic. I think we can fill a few hours with that. In general, I think they made already a few steps in a certain direction, which is a good one. But then they have either way got dropped a lot of stones in their way or do it by themselves, but they could do more. So they hesitate often in some cases where they don't have to be because they are afraid of doing something which they later regret on one or another scale, even if it's not so. They often try to double check how the response to their action could be, and they slow themselves down by doing this.
Sort of giving away the initiative to Russia in a sense.
Not directly to the Russians, but yeah, there's already the majority of the people here want to help and to stop this war, but by the way, how to do it, there's a lot of discussions and a lot of problems caused by people themselves instead of acting directly.
From the media, you get this impression that there's billions of dollars flowing into Ukraine and that the Ukrainian military is literally everything they could wish for. Would you say this is the case? And what are some requirements of your unit that are maybe not fulfilled? Could you just tell us about why also like the civilian side of the support is important, why donations are still required despite all these funding that Ukraine is receiving?
I think this is especially in certain aspects of this fights that you have now in this modern context. The basics are mostly organized, like weapons, ammunitions, food, and so on. But if you go on dealing with modern tactics, modern technologies, like especially stuff which is not so common in the most armies around the world right now, like drones and so on, which is not completely new, but the most armies didn't work a lot with it before. So especially I take this as an example for a lot of topics. This is a more or less new topic for combat. So you don't have a lot donations regard this from other nations, and the Ukrainian and the units take civil products to supplement this, substitute this. And for example, this civil drones, the quadcopters for reconnaissance and so on. But then you have to purchase them in one or another way, and then you need the assistance sometimes from these volunteer groups. That's why you still need this assistance, or thermal imaging devices, or something like this, which you don't have on this scale on the most armies. Yeah, so in such areas, there's still a huge lack of equipment, which you have to substitute out of the civil market.
Is this also relevant for your unit specifically?
Yeah.
And just to conclude, is there anything else you would want to share with the world in regards to this situation? Any message you want to pass along?
Probably I wasn't prepared for this question. Maybe I have a few ideas later, but right now not.
That's fine. Well, thank you so much for taking the time for this interview. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you for what you're doing.